Afternoon and good evening, everybody, from wherever in the world you are joining. My name is Ilse Asman. A warm welcome to all of you to this all-important webinar called Risk and Disaster, Safeguarding for Audiovisual Archives in Africa. Risk and safeguarding management of our audiovisual collections are often viewed in the light of natural disasters, such as fires and floods. But the preservation of the carrier, the information about the content, metadata, and technologies such as AI ensures that our collection is safeguarded and accessible for future use, with the advantage of assuring the authenticity of the material. Today's panel will look at both natural disasters and how technology plays a part in assisting with safeguarding and managing the risk of our collections. Professor Mpho Ngubane from the University of South Africa is our moderator for today. And Mpho, I will now hand over to you.
Thank you, Ilse, for your kind and immeasurable introduction. And thank you to the organizers for affording me this honor and privilege to moderate this webinar. Maybe it is because they know I prefer audiovisual records than paper-based ones. I don't know why I prefer audiovisual archives, but I guess they just really speak to me. Hashtag Preserve Africa Archives. And a good day, colleagues and cousins. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the standard time for South Africa now is 12:02 on this day of 7 October 2021. And welcome again to the virtual space of Broadcast Media Africa, BMA in short. And this webinar is hosted in collaboration with the Apricity Consulting in the month in which we celebrate World Day for Audiovisual Heritage, the month of October. And Audiovisual Day will be celebrated on the 27th of October. Maybe to just start by quoting from UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay, audiovisual archives tell us stories about people's lives and cultures from all over the world. They represent a priceless heritage, which is an affirmation of our collective memory and a valuable source of knowledge, since they reflect the cultural, social, and linguistic diversities of our communities. Most people will remember audio cassettes. They had side A and side B. That is why it was logical for its successor to be named CD. From side A and B, we then had CDs. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not alone, for I never walk alone, as the African proverb reckons that if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. I have with me a panel of experts, which I will call the 4 audiovisual musketeers. And these, ladies and gentlemen, are audiovisual archival divas. We have Michaela Singer, Principal Archivist, Special Collection at the University of Cape Town Library. And we also have Rafael Tiluna Ferreira, Professor at the Federal Fluminense University in Brazil. And we have Caroline, the founder associate of Archive TV. And as you have seen from the program, the theme for this seminar is risk and disaster safeguarding for audiovisual archives in Africa. And the topic for discussion from the broader theme is how we did it, mitigation and preventive measures for safeguarding audiovisual archives disaster effects. As I'm saying how we did it, I'm also tempted to say after the seminar, you can also say we can also did it. From the theme, there are 5 important issues that will be discussed, and they are reflected on the agenda and on the website. So to kickstart the program will be short and to the point, and participants are encouraged to write the questions or comments, compliments or complaints in the question and answer box or the chat box. And we will kickstart the program with a 10-minute presentation from Michaela and also Rafael. So the first presentation that will be shared is from Michal, and I'm going to ask her to share the presentation and do the 10 minutes presentation. Over to you, Michal.
There we go, I'm off mute. Thank you very much, Mpho, for the introduction. Thank you very, very much for the invitation to present today. I'm speaking to you from UCT Upper Campus within the library, very close to the Jagger site, where on the 18th of April 2021, wildfire spread throughout the UCT campus in Rondebosch and ultimately destroyed the Jagger Library, where the Special Collections Department of the libraries was housed. This was also where the audiovisual collection was housed. So, you know, within the framework of the discussion today, how we did it, mitigation and preventative measures for safeguarding audiovisual archives disaster effects, I'm afraid my presentation will be a bit more of a cautionary tale in regard to how we actually mitigated a disaster that actually happened. And I will hope to present some sort of overview of how one can mitigate a disaster, how one can prepare for a disaster. Nobody ever expects the disaster as bad as this, but it does happen, and it did happen. So really today is a discussion about the salvage and the recovery of special collections after the fire. But I think it's important just to give you a very, very quick overview about what the Jagger Library was, what it meant to the university, what it meant to the libraries. It was an active working space within a historic heritage building. This meant that we housed a department of about 20 staff members, as well as a reading room, which you can see in the background of this photo. Now, this library, the Special Collections Library, was quite an umbrella for very special heritage assets at the University of Cape Town, including the African Studies collections, especially books, films, maps, posters, newspapers, and various other collections that are very, very special to the study and scholarship of African studies. It also includes an incredibly well-developed government publications department, so much of the historical material was housed in the Jagger Library. Manuscripts and archives, we have about 1,600 collections in various stores, and approximately 250 of those collections were housed in the basements. Our entire audiovisual repository, except for film reels, which were kept in a separate cold store, were all kept in the Jagger Library, as well as the photography collections, other than the negatives in the cold store. The building was over the years used in different capacities. It was originally the main library. Over the years, it had different personalities. At one time, it was the Short Loan Library. It was ultimately restored in 2012 to its former glory, and a great effort was made to maintain a kind of the sense of the heritage value of this building. It was protected in that sense. Unfortunately, the reading room was closed to users since the pandemic, which was, since the beginning of the pandemic in South Africa in March 2020 in lockdown. And unfortunately, we were not able to reopen before the fire. And although staff members were working in the space and were providing scan and email services. So that's really just a snapshot of where we were when the library fire happened. And you'll see here a couple of images, both of the fire being handled by fire trucks all around the building. Helicopters were dropping water bombs on top of the fire. It took hours and hours and hours to put that fire out. At first we thought that everything was lost, but it was wonderful to discover when we could access the building that the basements were intact. And this, of course, kickstarted a salvage process, which lasted several months and ultimately resulted in our ability to salvage materials that were kept in the basement. So just to give a sense of the building itself, the schematics here on the left-hand side just gives you a sense of the floor. This was actually the reading room. So the fire started on the roof. This meant that the fire landed on the roof and kind of burnt its way through into the building. So the whole building was on fire. There was so much that could burn. A substantive amount of the African Studies collection of books was destroyed. The entire African Studies film collection was destroyed. That's 3,500 films that had been collected over decades and was perhaps one of the most comprehensive collections of African film. It was kept on DVD, and I will going to come back to that in terms of the implications of, the format with which libraries was required to keep the material. Unfortunately, many of the historical government publications were burnt. They were kept in the libraries. So, this was what we lost, and there was nothing we could do about that. The basements having survived, but this was another disaster to mitigate in itself. On the left, I've got a photograph. This is the very first photograph that I took when I entered the basement with the technical team as we were assessing the level of damage. It was pitch black. We used a cell phone flashlight, and I didn't actually realize that I was stepping in, how high the water level had gone. So if you look at the back of the image, you can see the shelving. This really meant that there was quite a lot of audiovisual material that was immersed in water, not just audiovisual material, also paper-based material, photographs, and so forth. So this was very much the beginning of the salvage. We immediately started pumping the water out. That took about 2 days, but nonetheless, you can imagine the implications of this, which was that we had to extract that material as soon as possible. Other material in the basement included some government publications, a Macmillan news clipping collection, as well as photographs and modern photography. The other implication of the audiovisual archives and modern photography, as opposed to the rest of our repositories, is that in terms of the intellectual property, this is very much owned by third parties. So, many people donate materials to us, but in particular, audiovisual archives characterized by it being donated or deposited by various filmmakers, photographers, many of them very active. So, we have taken it on, and the university, the libraries, is mitigating this disaster in full through the salvage, recovery, and ultimate digitization of this entire repository. So I'll speak to that as well. As I'd mentioned, the entire African Studies collection was destroyed. It was kept on level 5 in the Jagger Library. Unfortunately, because of copyright restrictions, we were not able to back up the films, to rip them or keep them on a server. We had to maintain them within a specific format in DVD, and that meant that the entire collection was lost. But because of the fact that we were subject to copyright restrictions, we had retained the VHS copies that had obviously been the previous format with which the libraries kept the films. And so we're actually able now to redigitize many of those films. And we've also made great strides in trying to restore the collection and basically source them at the films that we'd lost. Unfortunately, that's quite challenging because many of the films were quite rare. So there's quite a lot that's ongoing in various different directions within which we have to take to restore the collection. Ultimately, mitigating a disaster, which is the way in which I'm going to frame my discussion about the salvage. I just wanted to give a few of the suggestions that I have, that ultimately a few lessons learned from having to pick up the pieces after a fire. And I think the immediate one is have a disaster management plan prepared. I had noted previously, this is not a box ticking exercise. This can happen to anyone and anywhere. And I think the high profile of UCT meant this was very much in the press, but we must be aware that other fires have taken place throughout the world, in South Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa in recent years, and there is very little that can be done unless there is a plan of action in place. In terms of extracting your collection, of course, all collections are kept in a particular order. And if you have to remove everything in a hurry, it's very difficult to put that back together again. So one always needs to have in mind that you cannot necessarily use your pre-existing referencing systems to extract the collection. Therefore, an emergency referencing system is key. And I will discuss that a little bit more. How do you remove the materials? This is a very practical question. We basically put out a call for crates from various corporates, including the Ackerman Group, Pick n Pay, and various others, to contribute crates to facilitate the removal of the crates. We ultimately used between 12 and 13,000 crates to remove the collection. Most of the material is still sitting in those crates as we now are embarking on the recovery, not just of the collections, but also of the library itself, the offices, and the shelving of those materials is something that has to be thought of afterwards. But how do you keep the material you salvage? Human resources, you know, we're a department of approximately 20. The libraries as a whole is about 120. So how do you extract materials when you have to do it in a hurry? Because of course this disaster was time sensitive. Mold develops on materials within 48 to 72 hours, and that's it. You can't do anything about that. So if you don't remove the material in time, you know you're going to have to deal with mold. And nonetheless, it took us several weeks. But we implemented a volunteer program very quickly, and at least, you know, we made calls on social media. We networked as much as we could. At least 100 people were required per shift because we had to have human chains taking materials out of the basement. Now, especially when it comes to audiovisual materials, you have to be very, very sensitive about how you move that material. Magnetic tape, at the best of times, is very sensitive. So we had to be very careful when removing the material to not shake the crates, not to impact it more and create more adverse damage than was already the case. Now, what happens once the stuff comes out the basement and there's damage? Immediately, we had to consider the implications of the damaged materials. A community of practice of conservators in South Africa were brought in, and numerous conservators gave of their time, even taking leave from their jobs, traveling from overseas to man our triage tent, which we refer to it as in a very real sense of triage, to, in essence, treat the material in emergency conservation. Even audiovisual material was stabilized, treated for mold, and where the damage was really seen to be great, it was placed in cold storage to stabilize the material. We saw all of the material in the audiovisual repository as having been impacted adversely by the fire, even if it was not immersed in water, because ultimately it was sitting in this sort of chemical soup of damp. And, you know, we therefore have had to treat the whole collection as something that needs to be recovered and restored. One of the things that we started at during the salvage with volunteers, and that we've continued onwards afterwards with our staff in place, is to actually clean each item, which I'm going to speak to in a little bit. You actually have to clean each tape, each container, make sure there's no silt, no dirt that from the runoff, just to make sure that when you ultimately do get to digitize it, that magnetic tape is, the integrity of that tape has not been compromised any more than it has to be. Items are generally wrapped, and of course, as I spoke earlier now about the referencing system, the reason it's so important to maintain emergency numbering of and I'll speak to how we did it, is that you're ultimately going to be taking material out of its collection to be treated for mold or whatever, and how do you then put it back together again? Using the numbering systems of each collection, and each repository has a different number, becomes very complex, and therefore we utilized this emergency numbering by placing that, you know, the crate, each crate of material coming out had a number, and any item that came out of that crate would also get that number, so that it's actually possible to put the collection back together again. Each, emergency conservation techniques differ per item and format. They're all quite straightforward and repetitive, but it's not possible to just go into it willy-nilly. And the oversight and involvement of conservators was crucial to this process. And I think it's very important for us, you know, I think globally, but in South Africa in particular, conservation is quite a rare skill. It's a scarce skill that, you know, has really been highlighted through this experience. Here, what I wanted to show is really just a sense of the process. You know, our salvage operations, as I said, were quite intensive, but you can see here on this graph, really what it illustrates is how many crates were extracted, each day, and how many volunteers were used. And you can see that the weekend of the 25th of April, which in South Africa is Freedom Day weekend, we extracted over 2,500 crates. That is the audiovisual material. There really was a special effort to extract the AV as quickly as possible, to ensure that it could air dry, to ensure that what was impacted, what was damaged could be seen to. And we did not dehumidify, do not dehumidify audiovisual materials, because that will ultimately desiccate, dry out the magnetic tape. So it really is quite a ginger, you know, one has to really approach it with precious fingers, precious eyes. There was a lot of care involved in what we did. And this here really just illustrates, you know, the sense of urgency that we had. All our, you know, our staff were involved as team leaders, managing the volunteers. The PPE was acquired, remembering that this was also taking place during, luckily for us, during quite a low lockdown level in South Africa. But of course, you know, the safety and health risks were very, very real. First of all, occupational health in terms of masks. We, you know, always said to people, wear masks, not just for COVID, but also for the mold. Hard hats were really important, but also it was very important for us to very quickly take on the fact that we had volunteers who were giving of their time, and we had to ensure that they did not injure themselves. So one really had to be very aware of, you know, the people who were willing to get involved. What you're seeing here is not actually materials being taken out. On the right, what you're seeing is actually, in some cases, crates would actually have to be put together outside and then brought in. So the human chains were crucial just to keep things going, to keep the process running. The material had to be brought all the way from the bottom basement. On the left-hand side, you see the way that this is set up with ramps, that people were standing on all the ramps, and the material would be brought up. We would not fill the crates because, of course, that makes it very heavy, and ultimately the risk of damaging people's backs, the risk of people dropping the crates, etc., was quite real. And then on the right, you see the material being taken down to trucks or else being brought in to bring in crates. And then materials would either be taken to various storage facilities around the campus. We kind of commandeered some of the various departments, venues, the Center for African Studies Gallery, the Kaplan Center, the Jordan building opposite Jago was pretty much taken over by us for the fire. We had inductions before each shift, food was provided. This all took place in accordance with disaster management plan, with the requirements for a disaster management plan. You have to really consider everything. Water had to be provided to the volunteers in between each shift and during their breaks. The work was backbreaking. Just to give a little bit more clarity around what I mean by the emergency numbering system, whenever we moved materials, we wrote, as materials came out of the basement, there was somebody standing there writing down the number of each crate. So on the right-hand side, each bracketed number or series of number represents a crate. Where it's only one set of numbers, that's because it was only material taken from one shelf. Where you've got two sets of numbers, so for example, the second and third line, AV 25.2.5 and AV 25.2.6, that means that when people were taking the crates, the packers or the fillers were taking the material off the shelves, they would go from one shelf and then move down to another shelf. So if that gives you an understanding that the numbering reflects each shelf. So for example, on the left-hand side, you see a kind of schematic on the top left of what the basement looks like. Well, this is one of the basements, this is level 2, but it still is demonstrative of how we created the numbering system per bay, per stack of shelving, and then each shelf itself got a number. And that means that now what we can actually do, and we actually have done with the audiovisual material, is our staff, our library assistants have basically put the crates back together again in order, which means we've now got the collections intact in their order. That makes it possible now for us to actually go through the crates, to ultimately, really we have to do stock check for everything to assess it, but it also speeds up the process for us to create metadata for the ultimate digitization of that collection, of all the collections. How does that work? On the bottom left-hand side, you'll see a screen grab that I took of a spreadsheet we had developed. This is essentially a crate lookup system, which is in essence a synthesis of the library's pre-existing schematics of the basement, as well as the emergency numbering system. So we could ultimately meld the two. And that means that if you put in a first number and second number, the lookup code, it will show you what collection or what material was on that shelf. So it doesn't give us an item level numbering, but it facilitates the process of actually understanding what's what. And the reason that's so important for the AV, in the sense that it's a fairly new repository, most of our material has been donated in the last decade, all at once. And so we were actually, in fact, in the midst of an audiovisual audit of all of our material to ensure that we were ascribing a collection reference number to each item. But before that happens, it is very much possible that a VHS cassette, a Betacam, a mini DV, etc., may not be labeled with the collection number. It may not have recognizable information. And that's why it's really important to try as hard as possible to retain the ordering, the original order. And that's ultimately an archival principle that I would say applies to disaster management and every other aspect of archiving. So for me, this has been quite a learning curve and quite an interesting experience to see how information science has actually contributed to the disaster management. So as just to quickly run through, I mean, ultimately we had formalized this as a salvage and recovery project. This is, in fact, we are now in the recovery phase, which is a multi-year phase of this project. But I think really here I'm speaking to the salvage part, which is to say, I've given you very much part of it, but just to illustrate some of the processes that were overseen and managed by professional conservators, and ultimately skills were transferred to staff as well as volunteers. And some of our volunteers came every day, loved it. We're devastated when the salvage came to an end. So it was really quite a community. There was a sense of community cohesion, especially, you know, during the lockdown and the pandemic, where there was such a sense of isolation. People were so happy to contribute. And I think one can see this as just an outline of how people value heritage. You know, it really gave us a very clear understanding of how much people care about that. And the idea of a library burning has a lot of resonance. So just in terms of some of the processes, there was treatment of mold through ethanol and freezing. Very simple procedures, but one would have to know how to mix up the ethyl alcohol with the right quantities, you know, little things like, for example, not spraying directly onto the tape, but rather spraying onto a tissue and then using that tissue to gingerly wipe things off. Because if you spray directly onto a tape, you're going to basically wet the magnetic tape. So, I mean, like I said, they're all very commonsensical things, and we were able to roll that out to volunteers very successfully. But the involvement, or at least the advisement of a professional conservator is just highly crucial. Drying and dehumidification is ongoing. We had dehumidifiers in various spaces. I'm not going to really go into the paper-based dehumidification because that applies to more there, brushing of burnt material. But really here, it's the cleaning of analog formats of tapes and freezing where it was required. The freezing is such that, as we are now at UCT establishing out of this a formal conservation unit with a conservator who will be, you know, at a management level brought in, the material in cold storage will then be treated in a sense of remedial conservation and restoring the material where we can. However, we do need to accept that in some cases we are going to have to write things off. You know, it's a very devastating thing to realize, and I hope that it's at a minimum. But you know, salvaging the material was the first step. So there's a long road ahead of us before we can even provide public reports about what our losses were and what our gains were. But one of the more important things here, really, and I'm, you know, just giving you these indications in the background, just to show you how slow and how careful, what a passion project this was, what a real labor of love it is for any volunteer to have come in and done this. And people spend days and days and days just cleaning tapes. And as you can see on the left-hand side, you've got some tapes. And on the right-hand side, you know, I've just included in the triage tent some pictures, a photograph of negatives that are being dried. And as I say, one would have to assess down the line what it is, the extent to which we can preserve the material, especially if it becomes quite brittle. That's why digitization is such an important thing. So really my presentation, I would say, is understanding the needs of conservation, and also the importance of digitization. I just wanted to give you a sense here. On the left-hand side, you see the audiovisual collection. On the right-hand side, I have a photograph of our new the involvement of our vendors who will be coming in Bladeworks and coming in terms of the digitization project. This whole project is taking place at University House on Lower Campus at UCT, which is essentially a converted dining hall. We've basically, we've repurposed the venue. It looks very different to how it does in the photograph here. What we've done here is we've essentially separated out different repositories of AV. So essentially the archival film, which is really the substantive audiovisual repository, which has collections of filmmakers of significant social, cultural, and political value to South African history, individual filmmakers, as well as agencies. And what we've done is we've taken out paper-based files that would have accompanied the film. We've removed and separated and in fact gone through and audited the films, the African studies films. I mean, it's so wonderful to see little gains, where we didn't realize that we had it, but now we're like, yes, we can, a third of the film collection can be restored. And what the team has done is they've basically using the stickers, you can see the numbers on the stickers, they've basically put the collection in order again, essentially putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. And, one of the things we've been doing is a lot of peer-led and peer-led training. On the left-hand side, I just have a picture of my team. Andrea Walker is pictured here. She's our audiovisual archivist, in fact. She's sort of leading the metadata work for the digitization, and she's really demonstrating the cleaning of the tapes to our staff, because of course during the salvage, the staff themselves were involved very much in the physical side, and volunteers were busy with the cleaning. So it's a long road ahead of us, but it's some of the time I don't know how we could have prevented a fire landing on the roof. But I do think that it's possible for this to be really, like I say, a cautionary tale for people to be prepared and ready to know what to do when such a thing happens. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Michela, for your presentation. You have really said a mouthful. And thank you for sharing with us the disaster that struck at the University of Cape Town. I think the delegates or the attendees will learn a lot and avoid such in future, or also know how to react if such happened to them. Your presentation reminded me of a conversation with an old man in my village who told me that he used to have lots and lots of livestock. So I asked him, where is that livestock? So he took me to the decomposed cow droppings in the form of manure. I say that, you see, this is the evidence. So we don't want to leave dust. We want a real audiovisual records. And thank you once again. And attendees and participants are reminded to write questions, comments, compliments in the Q&A, and then we'll be able to discuss them later. And having said that, I see we have been joined by a lot of people that I know, like my former boss, Clive Kekut, I see you, and the former president of Liasa. I see the director of the National Archives of Eswatini, the Kingdom of Swaziland, and I also see the director for the National Archives of Namibia. So, and all others that I haven't mentioned, you are all welcome. And this moment, I'm going to give this moment to Rafael de Luna Freire, who is an associate professor at the Film and Video Department and in the Cinema and Audiovisual PhD program at the Fluminense Federal University in Brazil. Rafael, the virtual stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be invited to this discussion. I'm from Brazil, but I started a relationship with South Africa in 2019 when we organized the 4th BRICS Film Festival in our university. At the time, I had the initiative to, during the festival, to organize the first audiovisual preservation BRICS meeting, for which we invited people from all the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa. At that time, we have the pleasure to have in our university Professor Martin Botha from University of Cape Town and Joseph Dlamini from the National Film, Video and Sound Archives from South Africa. And during this meeting, we had the chance to know more about the reality of audiovisual preservation in each of the 5 BRICS countries and to share our knowledge. The idea when we organize the BRICS audiovisual preservation meeting is that we are used to read, to learn, to hear from North America and Europe experts about how to do. But the reality is that our reality is more similar between the BRICS countries than to some more traditional archives in Europe or United States. And I think it's very important to learn more about our colleagues from the BRICS and to share the knowledge that we have based on our specific reality that sometimes are very often is very different from the reality from other European or North American countries. So I'm very glad to be here. And that said, I'm not here to say anything about how to do, because I assume from the first talk that, of course, you know very well what to do. I'm sure that in South Africa, as in the other BRICS countries, as we said, you have very experienced experts on audiovisual preservation, and the question is not, I think, more what to do, to say what is good, what's not, but to learn from our current experience. So I'm very glad to hear about what happened in the library of UCT. I remember hearing through the social media about the fire and was very worried because we in Brazil had very recent fires that affect some of our most important archives, the National Museum and the National Film Archive, the Cinemateca Brasileira. So it's very good to hear from Michael talk. One thing that I believe it's very important, that is this transparency. We sometimes just hear about the fires, and months later we hear about reconstruction projects, etc. But we usually don't have access to what happened in the day following the disaster. That's crucial. We must know what others did, to learn what to think about what can we did if something similar happens to us. So this posture of sharing knowledge, not hiding what happens, and try to show just what interests to our image or to our public image of our institutions, I think it's crucial between experts as us. In this way, I'll talk a little bit about, I'm not an expert on preventing disaster, but I'll talk a little bit about my experience as a film archivist in Brazil. I've worked for many years in the Film Archive of Rio de Janeiro's Museum of Modern Art, which is one of the most traditional film archives in Brazil. And since 2017, I'm the head of one of the most recent film archives in Brazil, that is the LUPA, Audiovisual Preservation University Lab at my university where I teach, that is the Fluminense Federal University, that was created as a university regional thematic film archive, a very small one, working in partnerships with the most traditional film archives. And in this way, we have a very defined scope. We are preserving and promoting what we call amateur film in the state of Rio de Janeiro, which means sometimes we call orphan films, that are those usually less valued kind of film, as home movies, institutional films, advertising films, and in our case also student films, as my university is also one of the the oldest and most traditional film courses in Brazil. We have a BA in film studies and film practice. So we have been producing films by our students for more than 50 years. So most of those films were also shot on what we call non-professional or semi-professional gauges, as 16mm, Super 8, and then DV, VHS, Super VHS. So in this way, we have also in this umbrella of amateur cinema, including our own production, but more of that, we are also wishing to preserve what has been shot on film by normal people, regular people outside Rio de Janeiro, which is a city that one of the most famous city in the world and has been shot in many Brazilian and foreign films. But outside Rio de Janeiro, I think the other cities from the state of Rio de Janeiro, they have received much less attention regarding the preservation of images from these places and from this group of people. So that's our aim. In this way, I just brought some reflections about Brazil, about film preservation in Brazil regarding preventing disaster. First of all, I think we have this difference between human-caused disaster and natural disaster, which I think it's false, because when we talk about most natural disaster, they are not caused by other factors than man itself, as we have the responsibility for the climate changing that is making much more often disasters as fire and other kinds. So I think even when caused by nature, the man is responsible for them. But anyway, when we talk about natural disasters, usually we talk that Brazil is a place that is much safer than other countries because we don't have volcanoes, we don't have earthquakes, and etc. But that didn't make Brazil less privileged for disaster. We have had, for example, many fires here in Brazil, and it was increasing because of climate changing, of course, and floods also. So it's something that even if we would say that some countries are in better position than others, climate changing is changing this very fast, unfortunately. So to prevent natural disasters, this natural, as I said, we must talk about prevent, how to foresee something that we don't know when it will happen, how it will happen, supposedly. So, but in this way, I think the work of film archivists is to prevent, deterioration, is to prevent what can happen and what will probably happen, but to act first, to try to give you more time and not it happen now. Because as I always like to quote Ray Edmondson, when he says in a crucial way that we don't preserve anything because preservation never finishes. Nothing is preserved. Everything we preserve is being preserved. It never ends. So we have this mission of working until the end of our lives and passing ahead of our work, because we never complete our mission. We never finish. We are only as we live, postponing the decay of a document and making it available, guaranteeing that this generation and the other generation will have access to the documents, to the content and the support and the career of the documents we are preserving. But anyway, when we talk about preventing, we have to talk about organizing and making all the effort in order that something that never happens, and if happens, we can mitigate their consequences. I don't have much to say besides what Michelle had talked about preventing, but I want to say that I think, as I said, from my experience in Brazil, so complicated as natural disaster are human case disaster, and also I think this is kind of wrong because it's very rare to have a disaster caused by man. Usually, it's caused by what has not been repaired, as air conditioning, and it causes electric problems, and then fires, about installations. Usually it's caused by natural things that we need as lights and water, but it has not been repaired. And of course, as I see the UCT, but it's the case in most Brazilian institutions, or many archives are installed in historical buildings, so that have to be adapted to become not only archive, but to modern construction rules, and that makes it very difficult for us, not only more expensive to take safety measures, but also to decide between some how we spend our money, for example, to giving accessibility or to modernizing our system of prevention of fires, for example. And when I say accessibility, is that we have bigger public demand of not only when I talk about accessibility, it's also, for example, adapting the building for disabled people. That's very crucial, not only to give access, but also in case of emergency, and also giving access to our documents, which today means almost all the times to digitize them. So I think one of the most difficult things when we talk about preventing disaster is about how we use the money we have and to take decisions, because usually we have much less money than we need, so the decisions are much harder. So I think that in Brazil we have much more human caused disaster when we talk not about a specific tragedy that's caused by a man, for example, fire, but from decisions from the system that implies that we have to make difficult decisions that we should not have. So in archives, we have, for example, staff that's usually under, it's less people than we need. We have underfunded institutions, and we have insensitive directors. Now I'm talking here about my experience in Brazil, in which we had the fires we had in our institution, for example, National Film Archive, are strictly linked to lack of staff, lack of funding, and insensitive directors regarding what is best for the institution and for its collection. In this way, I think the biggest questions about how to prevent not only disaster, but the decay of our collection is to give the staff, the part of the staff, our experienced technicians, the power to decide what is best to do and give conditions for them to work in this way. I think there's not a magical solution. That's maybe a frustrating thing to say, but there's no magical solution. It's only to make the work the best way you can to mitigate the risks, but there only will be risks. So that implies why I said staff, because I think for my experience in Brazil and the last tragedies we had, main cause of disaster is a small number of staff that makes the collection or the building in some moments without the due checking, the due presence, the due following, and the due measure that should be taken. When you have a small staff, you have to choose what to do. So it's always the question of choice. If we had, I mean, 2 people instead of 10, these 2 people will not do what the 10 should do, that repairing, taking care of noticing. And if we don't have money, you won't do what's necessary. And the main cause, if you don't have a sensitive director, sensitive head of the sector, it won't. It doesn't mean to have money or people if they don't do what is necessary according to the technicians. So unfortunately, I think there is no magic solution, and even the digital should not be seen as a solution, much less magical. Because when we have these analog documents, papers, film, tapes, and etc., a tragedy is always visible. You cannot destroy thousands of tape without calling attention to people, be by flood, by fire, etc. The digital has, of course, the main advantage that you can make copies, and as is the basic rule, to store it online and offline, on-site and off-site. So you have greater chance of surviving if you have an incident in one place, if you have copies in the cloud or in another physical place. But all of that, of course, implies much more money. When you duplicate your collection in digital way, you spend the double of money or almost double. So of course, it's an important measure, but always difficult because you have to fund for that. And different from analog documents, as I said, it's important, it's impossible to be destroyed without calling attention. The digital can disappear silently and abruptly without calling attention. You can lose your entire digital assets without nobody outside the archive realizing it. It's just a question of an incident, a human caused or a machine caused incident, and you lose your entire HD with our entire dozens of thousands of documents, be paper documents, be sound documents, be moving image documents in digital formats. So I think it's also important, this transparency, it's, as I said in the beginning, is crucial because digital losses can be hidden and probably are being hidden all the time because it's never good for an institution to, when the public opinion knows about something that has been lost, mainly for its directors. So to conclude, I will not talk a lot because I'm more interested in the Q&A and in the discussion, but I just want to give these reflections, and also because digitization is not a solution. For example, we talked here about moving image formats, VHS, DVDs, digital, etc. We have information in each carrier, of course, in the cover, in the box, and many kinds of digital expressions of a document in each format. And it's true, especially here, I think, in Brazil, as in South Africa, the reality of our film industry, because even when we talk about restoration, for example, it's, as I said in the beginning, the need to exchange experience between the BRICS country, because sometimes I hear from a FIAF technician, you should restore your film from your pristine nitrate negative in 4K, 8K, and then we said, we don't have our negative. Our film has survived sometimes in a VHS copy. why are we digitizing 8K a VHS copy? And this is not a lack. This is not as we are inferior. These are reality for many reasons, and you must face. For example, I was remembering saying, listen to the first expression here in Brazil. We had a very intense production of, for example, pornographic films in the early 80s. That some of those films, in the end of our dictatorship, when they were forbidden, after some judicial fights, they were allowed to exhibit foreign pornographic films, and the national production, of course, started producing pornographic films, explicit sex films, and it was a boom in the industry. And of course, for aesthetic, moral reasons, they were not considered to be documents that should be preserved. So it's very interesting because some of the biggest box office in our film industry in the early 1980s, so not very far, I mean 40 years ago, 30 years ago, were films that now have been preserved only on VHS copies that were distributed later to their theatrical release in 35 millimeters. So, of course, we usually think about preserving our biggest films or most sophisticated creative works. But when we talk about film industry, for example, we have this example of films that have not been preserved. And sometimes the VHS distribution, of course, of pornographic films was huge. And that made some copies of this VHS to survive. So it's just an example I wanted to share because from what I have learned also, for example, digital formats are crucial for the preservation of African cinema. And it's not only a reality of Africa, but as it is also from parts from the film heritage of Brazil, for example. So I just want to conclude and thanking for this invitation, and I've learned a lot, and I hope to learn and to discuss more with the colleagues in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael, for your presentation. And indeed, sharing is caring. And we thank you for sharing your experience in Brazil and also your collaboration with South Africa as part of the BRICS. But there is a local restaurant here in South Africa called Nando's. They don't believe in sharing. They just say you buy your quarter chicken and eat alone in your corner. But thank you for sharing. And having said that, we are now moving towards the fourth industrial revolution, towards the AI. And in this regard, we are going to have Aparna, who has a Master's of Arts in Art Conservation from the National Museum Institute in India. She's going to commentate and advise about risk management and related AI with regard to AVs. I'm going to hand over to you, Aparna, to take us through before we call Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. And I am not going to speak about artificial intelligence. Sorry if that was the... I'm going to speak about disaster risk management, and that too from the perspective of AV heritage. And I represent here ICCROM, the International Center for the Study of Preservation of Cultural Property, and it is based in Rome. It's an intergovernmental organization, and I coordinate a program on sound and image collections conservation, as well as first aid and resilience for cultural heritage in times of crisis. And it's from the perspective of these two programs and leading training on disaster risk management for heritage, all types of heritage, tangible and intangible, that I'll be speaking today. And the first thing that I would like to bring to your attention, and has already been pointed out through previous speakers is that one of the biggest factors why we should be worried about disasters is because climate change is widespread and it is intensifying. As we have heard in the IPCC, as we have read in the IPCC report, they have sounded code red for humanity. And what does that mean for cultural heritage or for people? It means we will be experiencing extreme weather events more frequently, more intensely. We would be some places will experience floods, some places will experience droughts, and with that there will be the impact on, we'll have more forest fires, long heat wave spells. All that does not paint a rosy picture for audiovisual archives and the heritage field, which is already constrained, struggling with resources, and has to now step up on effective risk management and ensuring that in the time to come, when we will be facing multiple hazards, like already, this is a picture from Europe where once in a millennium floods coincided with the COVID outbreak. We will be facing more of these kind of cascading or compound disasters where our resources will be stretched thin. When we say the word disaster, what do we mean by it? I would like that to be, and thank you, Mikhail, for that very strong presentation. And actually, you felt it on your skin. But still, let's look at the definition of word disaster. Disaster means huge disruption, huge impact, right? It is when there are multiple, people are disrupted, normal life is disrupted, we lose lives, there is, infrastructure is gone, there is total chaos, and for a life, for a moment, or at least for a period, a certain period of time, depending on the intensity and the extent, spatial extent, life comes to standstill. And it is not the same as we know it. So this is what we are talking about. When there is huge disruption and you would like resources to be allocated to cultural heritage and its rescue, everybody will need help and cultural heritage will need help. So we have to be very careful on what are we asking for. And we have to really realize the meaning of asking for help during a huge disruption which is caused by a disaster. The photo that you see is from the big earthquake that occurred in Japan in 2011, following which there was a tsunami. So what are we talking about? We're talking about impact on economy, impact on people, impact on infrastructure, and impact on heritage. And in that scenario, we would like to protect heritage as well as prevent, if possible, prevent this from happening. So this is what we are talking about in this presentation. That means our objective should be that in the next 5 to 10 years, we should be safeguarding our heritage from disasters, and we have to somehow cut this risk path. So even if the disaster is occurring in your city, in your neighborhood, what we are looking for is that we try to minimize its impact on cultural heritage, and we try to somehow, create a buffer between heritage and what is happening outside, right? Here, I want to highlight one thing. We have been talking about fires, and in the case of the UCT, it was a fire which started outside, which was like a forest fire which got out of control, and then it reached the library. But what we need to understand is often people mistake hazardous events or accidents, which may have a very huge impact on heritage, with disaster. So I think that confusion where you think that you will be in control when this is happening is very misleading and has been one of the problems that in the literature that we have produced thus far has been talking about emergencies. It has not been talking about disasters. Disasters, by definition, have a legal definition in every country. They have a certain response in every country. Funds are activated within that legal, I would say, through that legal mechanism. And we need to understand that very well, because we will be asking for help. When we are talking about disasters, we'll be asking for help, and we need to understand what is the machinery, what is the response machinery, what is the prevention, infrastructure, and how can we benefit as cultural heritage from them. So the first people who should be sitting here are your local city officials, your civil protection, and your local disaster risk reduction agency. And unfortunately, meeting after meeting, we fail to involve them in such key discussions because we do not understand our disaster risk. We do not understand what is our disaster risk. So if you do not understand what is the disaster risk, what is the risk of your library, your archive, your audiovisual collection becoming caught up in a disaster, then how would you even go about preventing it? Now, first thing that we need to do is analysis of our geolocation and setting. Setting could be very serene, it could be beautiful. You are in a countryside location, then you are limited response-wise, you're far away. There could be a hazard coming from your location, like a forest fire, but your location could be a city, and the next door petrol pump could be your hazard point, right? You need to understand where is your hazard coming from and how would it reach your institution. And the first line of defense, which is your building, would it stand that hazard? And to understand that hazard and the intensity of that hazard, you also need to go back into history and say what has happened here before and how drivers like climate change or unplanned development could worsen the impact of that hazard in your area. And to understand that better, first thing, look up on Prevention Web. There are hazard maps. Look up in your city, area. They have, every city has about 100 scenarios that they play with, disaster scenarios. See which ones are most likely, and then chart your location on the path of the disaster. Something so simple, but we fail to do it every time. And then we say disasters happen. I'm going to give you an example from my archive, ECROM archive. We are in Rome. We are in old historic city of Rome, Trastevere. It's a historic quarter. There's a river next door, and there have been, it's banked, it's very well banked, but in October and this September, October, November, it rains heavily in Rome. There is a possibility with what is happening in the changes like there is a heavy rain scenario, we have played with it and our civil protection has endorsed this scenario. This area is supposed to can be inundated, but how will it be inundated? Now, what is the risk driver? The risk driver and what's the vulnerability which is coming from outside? Rome nowadays is dealing with a garbage crisis, and there is a lot of garbage, and easily our drains can flood and localized flooding can happen. Moreover, as our Brazilian colleague pointed out, our archive is also in an old building, which is always going through repairs, and also because of lack of funds, the repairs are not that good, and every now and then we have issues with our roof. So there is a likelihood that our false ceiling could fall, and which room our false ceiling could fall in the scenario of heavy rain. You have to identify, and that means structural analysis, and that means involving engineers. So not only collection people, try to understand the kind of stakeholders you need to involve in disaster risk management. So room 4 would mean, we have identified room 4. We have done a structural analysis. We have identified this is the room where we need to do mitigation first. We need to reinforce the roof here. And this is the point that I want to bring to your attention, that scenario-based mitigation helps to direct efforts at the root cause of the problem. So if you are only going to do emergency planning, you will be treating the symptoms, not the root cause. But if you're going to actually look into risk assessment, disaster risk assessment, and assess your vulnerabilities as well as your capacities in relation to that disaster scenario, it will allow you to do mitigation, and mitigation at multiple levels. At the level of your region, district, which will be in collaboration with your government, of course. At the level of your site, which will be in collaboration with your neighbors. At the level of your building, if it is owned by government, then with those stakeholders. And at the level of your display, storage shelves, packaging, support, fittings, which is at your own institutional level, and the collections and materials level, which is where you will go into film, VHS, storage, tape or digital, what kind of AV media you're dealing with. And that's number 4. But until now, I have only been listening about number 4, or maybe at this level, but I haven't heard about the region, site, building, anything. That's not in our decision making. So how are we going to control our disaster risk? The point was well made by Richard Wright. I was reading his questions, and it's like vulnerability of AV materials has to be understood. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. In an isolated geographical location is very important. Trying to having it on cloud, on other. So we have to look into those kind of storage solutions and everything. But we also have to understand that AV materials are the most fragile, and they can be easily damaged with water, with fire, with excessive heat, and sometimes the protection environment that we create around AV, which is air conditioners and all, they can malfunction and cause fires, even in the event of a flood, or even like after an earthquake. Fires can occur. So sometimes the risk will be made more, I would say it will compound the risk if we do not look at the infrastructure that we create to care for AV collections, and then do not maintain it, and it doesn't show in our budget items, in our budget lines, that we are doing the maintenance. So for every every time we go to our management for creating a new storage, we should think about long-term and think about how much of that money that we are asking for should be allocated to its maintenance. So I think due diligence has to be paid to understand how much are we asking for, and how much are we allocating to maintenance. It should appear as a budget line in our institutional planning. Finally, coming to response, it was amazing to see the response of UCT, and this is exactly what we have to understand. Do institutions have access to early warning systems? Do you have spaces for evacuating collections, backup for digital data, trained staff, and volunteers? So some of these factors can easily tell you what capacity you have for responding to a large-scale disaster. And again, keeping in mind that your staff may not be able to reach your site. And in this case, volunteers were very well handled. The staff was on site, but this was one disaster. But I have been in situations in Haiti, in Nepal, in Indonesia, in after Hurricane Haiyan, after Typhoon Haiyan in Philippines, where thousands just died. Local population was just decimated. And then you need the help of outsiders. So really share, also understanding where collections are and sharing that information with authorities who are responding is very important. And that's why making a contact with your civil protection would be, I think, the first step. I think if you want to do really something serious about disaster risk management, go and contact your local civil protection or your local response agency, because without their being notified of your presence, you can make a very good disaster plan. But if the moment it becomes a large scale emergency, you won't be able to respond. Now, one of the big problems that we are dealing with at a level of ICCROM and UNESCO is that in an international response setup, when a country that has gone through a major disaster asks for help to United Nations and other bodies, there is a cluster. There's a cluster system where organizations come together around one cluster. So the cluster for shelter is there, cluster for food is there, cluster for water, sanitation, even communication is there, but there's no cluster for culture. So since there's no cluster for culture, the funding for culture is ad hoc. And in the first hours, when a disaster strikes, a lot of heritage gets demolished or cleared up in the rubble. This is a picture which we received hours after earthquake in Nepal, where also lots of audiovisual collections were lost. So to increase coordination, now I'm working with the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group to try to integrate concerns for cultural heritage in the first phases of a disaster, like immediately after a disaster, when life-saving is going on. We are trying to get cultural heritage included in that, at least at the level of information sharing. And let's see if we are able to come up with some guidelines, but it has to really go through a whole review, an international review from all countries, and only then this would be approved, because this would be adding one more component to life-saving. So in the meantime, if that is happening, Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a broad agreement where all governments have signed to spend money on disaster risk management, culture has been included. So that gives you reason to contact your local civil defense, civil protection, or army, or humanitarian NGOs, and work with them and try to first assess your disaster risk and then develop capacities subsequently for, on a common scenario on how you would share personnel, resources, and information if in case of a large-scale disaster. And this also means that you have to work with your do training of your staff, but this training must happen more at a larger scale. And this cannot be emphasized enough, that this has to be a multidisciplinary training, and it should not be, very specific kind of training. ICCROM is doing this through the First Aid and Resilience for Cultural Heritage in Times of Crisis program, which is a new flagship program of ICCROM, founded in 2020, coinciding with COVID and with many other disasters. In the first year alone, we reached 32 countries, but now that has increased and to 54 in 2021, and we have created 107 new partnerships. We are very keen to develop training for audiovisual archives, documentary heritage, and developing targeted disaster risk management plans. We have a worldwide network of cultural first aiders in 87 countries, because this program is built on 10 years of training. And cultural first aiders are exactly the kind of people who are trained to deploy in a disaster situation when there are other concerns. And also these are the people who are trained to deploy themselves in a safe way, and they're not a burden, they're not a liability on the system, because to be able to work in a disaster situation, you have to ensure safety of the personnel that you're putting on. It's great that UCT was able to do this, but a lot of it also involves, there's the idea of insurance of people who you are deploying in a potentially dangerous situation, supporting them when they come out of it, because it's a traumatic situation and mental health issues arise. And it has happened to me personally. So I can tell you mental health issues are very real. And if you spend a lot of time in a disaster zone, you need to think about that. And you have to think about people's well-being. And whatever resources we want to allocate to heritage in times of disaster, we should think about it, how we are going to pay back the society. So a very good reason why culture cannot wait should be there. And that's the slogan of our program, Culture Cannot Wait, and how it is tied to a community's resilience. And we have some guidance, multilingual guidance online, which does talk about different phases, also gives methodology for risk assessment, but also post-disaster, what you can do and how you can coordinate and develop workflows and things like that. Hopefully this, and there are also some videos, some games, and also we offer advice. So if anyone would like to get in touch with me, you're most welcome. Thank you for your attention, and Culture Cannot Wait. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna, for reminding us about the risk mitigation, that it helps to treat, and it reminds us to treat the root causes rather than reacting to what happens thereafter. We are missing a Russian and Chinese presentation to complete the BRICS plot. But nonetheless, last but not least, we are going to have a talk by Caroline Caruela to take us through how her organization managed disaster and risk. Caroline, the stage is yours, and I see we are running short of time.
I'll try to make it short.
You can go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And I don't know about all of you, but I feel my heart beating hard, and probably lots of you too, because we've been dealing with very serious matters, and a sense of anxiety grown during the discussion. And that's normal. That's normal because it's a serious topic we're around. So first of all, I'd like to give you words about who we are. So my name is Caroline Caruel, and I'm talking to you from France, from Paris. I have with our company, Archive TV Group, more than 20 years of experience in audiovisual and film preserving and archiving. Internationally, worldwide, you will find us under another name rather than Archive TV, which is actually Mobilitas Imaging. So Mobilitas is the brand under which we operate specifically in 54 countries in Africa to try to help preserving and dealing with audiovisual archives. What we do is actually storing, preserving archives, dealing with its digitization, and indexing, meta tagging. Let's say large comprehensive inventory and metadata around that. My position is very specific because, as you understand, we are service providers where you are in charge of national archives. So as service provider, we endorse for our customers the risks and the disaster safeguarding rules, meaning that under our contracts, we are to put in place some disaster plan to make sure that we handle certain type of risk. So the experience I can share with you is the experience I have as a service provider in storage and dealing with audiovisual archive. Many things was, we spoke about a lot of things, but I want, first of all, to come back to my HAL presentation with the fire in the Jagiellon University library, sorry, and give you a tip to help. I was in charge to organize and move the library of Canal+ TV channel. This library was 500,000 tapes. The question was, how can we move all of these tapes out of this TV building within 3 days in case of flood of the Seine River? And how can you organize this evacuation plan that must be done in less than 2 days in case of the river level is going up? So it's very close to what Arpana was talking to you, which is very true. Look around your buildings and identify the risks that are not inside but outside your building. Flood of a river is one of them. So let me give you a few operational answers to that. What we've done is, first of all, we decided to change the modality of storage, of physical storage of the tapes. Mikhail, you said that to evacuate the library, you had to use crates. We do use these crates, not only to evacuate, but to store, so that actually tapes on shelf, which are archives, can be accessed. So they are in boxes. These boxes have a barcode and the boxes are on shelves. That helps preventing disaster from dust. That helps moving and evacuating the storage in case of emergency. So an easy answer that can be part of your safeguarding plan would be to think about the way you store. And if it's archives that have been already digitized, meaning the time you need to access this archive is not emergency, you would go first to the file, then to the tape. So these tapes can be they can be packed into boxes, and the box is put on shelves. Then if a risk occurs, then you can evacuate quicker your library. As an example for Canal+ storage, this is what we've done. And we could stand a contractual commitment to evacuate the storage within 2 days in case of flood of the Seine River. This packing on boxes for storage is also very practical because it helps you in terms of reversibility. Let's say you want to move your storage out of your place to a provider like we are, Mobilitas or AGS or whatever. It's very easy because you're moving crate to your provider. You know what's in the crate, you deal with it. If you want to change or move your archive elsewhere, it's easier to move a box rather than to move each tape individually. So one of the answers to a disaster plan would be to rethink the modality of storage and use these boxes to pack and store your tapes, preventing dust, preventing tapes from falling down from the shelves, and also helping the moving of your tapes or reel when you need them. Second, very practical tip on film archive. When I created my activity 30 years ago, we were we were promoting and we were doing vacuum packing of film reel. You know that films suffer from humidity and temperature. So what we did is that, first of all, we put the film at 30% humidity level, and then we pack these reel into an aluminum bag made of 7 layers, and it's vacuum sealed so that no ambient air and oxygen can go inside the bag. But at the same time, these bags prevent from any water damage, any light damage, any dust damage. So vacuum pack your film reels before they reach the stage of vinegar syndrome is a practical solution you can use to preserve your asset from flooding, but also from dust from a fire, as an example, and prevent also risk coming from the light, because light, of course, is damaging for film archive. So vacuum packing of films may also be a very good solution for what Raphael said and about climate changes. Climate changes with more heat and more humidity sometimes. It's very costly within a building to do cold storage and low humidity at the same time. So you can put a micro environmental answer to your storage modality, which is put your reel at 30% humidity, vacuum pack it, and then you can put this reel in any standard fridge, because you don't need to control any more humidity, you just need to control temperature. In case of disaster in your storage, again, this is very easy to move. You have less constraint to deal with maintaining temperature, humidity during evacuation, because your reel is vacuum packed. It doesn't suffer any humidity risk, and you can just move them to any fridge you can find in the food industry or whatever to maintain the cold and the humidity for your film collection. So this is a second very operational tip that maybe you can think about to deal with your disaster safeguarding plan. Because we are very short on time, I would like to switch immediately to the digital matter. Of course, we like to digitize assets and content. To preserve them, yes. To duplicate them, yes. But remember that first topic of digitization is to display to the most people we can. Of course, broadcasting digital asset is linked to right ownership issues, and that's right. But we think that digitization is really a great way to safeguarding audiovisual assets, because it helps you also dealing with your insurance contract. When you go to an insurance company to cover your risk on your collection, the question will be, what is the cost to redo your content? If the answer is, we don't have any way to redo the content, then the insurance coverage would be zero. So if you cannot redo a content, the insurance company, unless you have subscribed some artwork like paintings, original paintings and unique paintings contract, the response of an insurance company would be basically you are covered zero. What an insurance company can cover is the cost to redo something. This is why digitization is precious, because you have a file, you can call your insurance to fund the copy of your files, or we wouldn't do a copy on the tape, but at least you have a budget available with your insurance company to cover some mitigation costs from the disaster. We spoke about audiovisual items, tapes, reels, etc. We must talk about metadata, inventory, and knowledge around all of that. Probably the first action that needs to be taken care at the highest level in the various corporations with budget around it is, do we have a complete inventory of what we have? Have we done the searching for duplicates, and have we isolate masters, originals from duplicates, so that we can separate the storage and then separate the risks, not having in the same building original masters and duplicates? If you don't have an inventory, you don't know where are your duplicates, and you can't do this separation, physical separation on tapes and digital separation on files. If you need to mitigate one of your disaster, you will need the full inventory of what is concerned by the mitigation, and not only the shelf number and the number of tapes, but also details about the content and the importance of what has been damaged by the risk. So very shortly, comprehensive inventory of the full collection must be done. It's not necessary anymore to move your collection out of your buildings to do that. As an example, we come to the archive actually not only to inventor, but also to digitize. So with our Mobilitas imaging division all around the world, and specifically in Africa, we bring the knowledge, we bring the people, and we bring the gears inside the archival buildings. So you don't need to move your archive for the inventory to be done, the comprehensive inventory to be done, and the digitization process to be ongoing. Where Raphael and Arpana are very right is that all about digitization is also to create the budget for migration. Audiovisual is a migration history. So we need migration budget for the past, but we already need budget to migrate what is created today digitally. So opening budget lines at the highest level in the corporation is not only for the past, but it's already there for what we are producing and what is born digitally every day. Well, I think we've been through a lot of a topic, and so I will stop there my talking. But as we see, as a provider, we must have answers and solutions. And I was happy to share some very specific tips with you. And I would like to leave space within this conference to question and answer.
Thank you, Caroline, for your comprehensive presentation, and also reminding us that inventories and metadata are necessary for mitigating the disasters, and also touching on the issue of migration, which is also linked to technological obsolescence. And there are just a lot of issues that we haven't covered. And I ran in short of time. Time is very crucial. And from my side, I do have questions in the chat box. I will ask that those that haven't been asked questions, they can just forever hold their peace, because I'm not going to give even a minute for just to say bye to the audience. Raphael, your question, if you can answer it in 20 seconds, it is from Richard Wright. And then I'll also read the one that for Michaela. The question to Raphael says, you stated that making digital backup copies is expensive. Have you considered using free storage at internet archives? They will generally accept anything that belongs to the library. This is a question for Raphael from Richard Wright. And we do have questions to Michaela. I think she answered some, but she can just in 2 minutes wrap up. did you say the film collection was on DVD? Backup copies, and what about the backup copies?
Okay, so
And then-
yeah, just okay after.
Yes, and then the last one is, can you quantify in terms of percentage how much you managed to salvage in your library during the disaster? And if there is where those that, if there are copies elsewhere that you can buy or even ask for donations. And the issue of migration, I think, is covered. And then from here, I will just hand over to Ilse. But you can just say in a minute, and then Rafael in 20 seconds. Thank you.
Yeah, I answered him in the chat. We are using Internet Archive for digital access copies, but I think one crucial question is a service for the master digital files, which are much bigger files. And it's a question to discuss if it's interesting for a Brazilian institution to keep the digital master file in a service which servers are outside Brazil, which is the case
Okay.
of Internet Archive.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Mikhail.
Thank you very much. So the question has been dealt with in the chat. I think just to summarize it, the question, and I think the critique is that, you know, backups of the DVDs of the film collection should have been made. And I think, you know, in South Africa, the debate has raged for many years around format shifting, especially around technological obsolescence. But unfortunately, the South African copyright law does not allow for this. Libraries are subject, I think more than any other body, to you know, to these laws in terms of many aspects of libraries. You know, if we have subscriptions, we have to abide by the contracts of those subscriptions. If we have issues around copyright, we have to retain that. It is our responsibility in that respect, and that we are custodians of intellectual property. You know, format shifting has been a legal gray area for many years. And I think the ongoing debate around the Copyright Amendment Bill in South Africa is quite difficult, you know, around that. People have gotten into legal trouble. It is the case, you know, so the extent to which, you know, some copyright policeman is looking out for whether or not we shift, we can't just circumvent laws. I mean, DVDs, especially if we purchase films, have technological protection. There are measures in place not to rip a DVD. So, you know, we also have to maintain best practice. We can't, you know, copy tapes. We can't copy them and back them up. It's illegal. It's simply illegal for us to do so. And as Nikki, who is our line manager for special collections and also the outgoing president of LIASA has mentioned, LIASA and several bodies have been lobbying for the amendment of this copyright restriction. So unfortunately, the library's hands were tied. We were not able to simply back up the films. Where we digitize the archival film, which is to say the not so much the published material, but the unpublished. So for example, raw footage, when we digitize that, we do back it up. And of course, we are engaging in digital preservation. That's a very big part of what we've been, you know, working towards, is being able not just to back things up on a server, but actually to digitally preserve them. And I think that's another discussion altogether. You know, one also has to consider not just the digitization, but the digital preservation. You know, what is the infrastructure required for that? So, you know, unfortunately, you know, we're not necessarily prioritizing copyright over preservation as based on our discretion, but we are having to abide by the laws that pertain to libraries in South Africa until that changes. And, you know, we're all for it changing. We're all for being able to preserve our material in, you know, in a more sustainable way. So it really was a tragedy. And I think it really demonstrates the need, the very, very important need to update copyright law in terms of, you know, the fourth industrial revolution. That's what we're seeing, is the laws are not necessarily protecting us as they should. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Ilse now to wrap up. And the last issues is that I've been receiving questions about the link to the presentation and how do we go about continue with this debate. I think the organizers can, when they wrap up, they can also answer those questions. And I thank all the panelists and all the participants and attendees. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for being a really excellent moderator to this conference. And thank you very much, Michal, Raphael, Apana, Caroline, for coming on board and gave us really a very interesting discussion with your presentations. I always think that an hour and a half is too little. And especially when we start touching on issues such as safeguarding, we didn't get even through half of what we really wanted to discuss, and that's the other half of safeguarding your collection, metadata, and using the technologies towards that. So I think we do have a need for another panel discussion. But as I can see on the comments, it was a really lively discussion. I appreciate all the effort that you put and thinking that you put into this to create this excellent panel discussion. I also see that participants were reluctant to leave. That in itself is a very good indication to us. For those of you who wonder if the link of this recording will be available, yes, it will be. It is normally sent to everybody that is registered. You will get it. The organizers, Esther and Corsi and Yonella, will make sure that it reach you. And until next time, I wish you a pleasant day, a risk-free day, and may your collections be safe. Until next time. Thank you very much, everybody.